The air that night in Chapel Hill was calm, ordinary. The kind of night that passes unnoticed, quiet and predictable. But that tranquility was shattered with a single phone call, a report of gunshots echoing from a wooded area not far from the University of North Carolina campus. Responding officers combed through the darkness, their flashlights slicing through the thick woods. When the beam of one flashlight landed on a lifeless figure, everything about the night changed. It was a young woman. Her body lay still, crumpled among the leaves and underbrush. She had been shot multiple times, the evidence of her final moments etched in the ground and on her body. The officers worked swiftly, securing the scene and calling for reinforcements. I arrived shortly after, and the weight of the discovery hit immediately. The victim was young, vibrant even in death, with a face that seemed frozen in disbelief and terror. The Idaho in her belongings confirmed her identity, Eve Carson. The name meant something to me even before the investigation began in earnest. She wasn't just a student, she was a leader, the student body president of Chapel Hill, known across campus for her infectious energy and dedication to helping others. I knew her name would send shockwaves through the university and beyond. As the scene was processed, the brutality of the crime came into focus. Multiple gunshot wounds were evident, 4 shots targeting her body and a 5th to her head. This was no accident, no random escalation. This was calculated, deliberate. The nearby evidence, a car tire impression, a few faint footprints, hinted at the series of events that brought Eve here but gave us few answers. Whoever had done this had been careful, leaving little behind except the horror of their act. In the hours that followed, the details of Eve's life began to surface, each fact making her death all the more incomprehensible. She was a woman who had dedicated herself to others, from her peers on campus to underprivileged teens in her hometown. She had aspirations that reached far beyond Chapel Hill, dreams of shaping public health policy or leading humanitarian efforts. She had a future, and someone had stolen it. Interviews with her friends and classmates painted a picture of her final hours. Eve had spent the evening out with friends, laughing, celebrating life as she always did. She was heading back to her car when she encountered 2 men, strangers who saw her not as a person but as an opportunity. Demario Atwater and Lawrence Lovett Jr. approached her in the parking lot. They forced her into her car at gunpoint, and from that moment her fate was sealed. What followed was a sequence of events so senseless, so cruel, that it was hard to piece together without emotion clouding the facts. They drove her to multiple ATMs, forcing her to withdraw cash. Each transaction was captured by surveillance cameras, showing Eve alive, her fear palpable, her captors' faces partially obscured but distinguishable. The recordings would become our first tangible lead, a lifeline in a case that was already overwhelming in its gravity. Eve's attempts to reason with her captors were recounted by forensic psychologists who reviewed the crime. She had pleaded for her life, offered them everything she had, asked them to take her back to campus. But her words fell on deaf ears. They drove her to a secluded wooded area, far from the lights and safety of the city. As the car came to a stop, Eve must have known what was about to happen. And still, in those final moments, she showed extraordinary grace. Witness accounts suggested she asked to pray with them. It was a request that humanized her even in the eyes of monsters, but it wasn't enough. When the final shot was fired, Eve Carson, a young woman who had inspired so many, was gone. As the sun rose that morning, we stood at the edge of the crime scene, each of us feeling the weight of what had happened. This wasn't just a murder, it was an attack on everything we were supposed to protect. Chapel Hill is a community built on trust and hope, and now it was fractured. We couldn't bring Eve back, but we owed her justice. And we owed it to her family, her friends, and everyone who had looked up to her. The investigation began in earnest, fueled by equal parts anger and determination. Every clue, every piece of evidence was a potential key to finding the men who had done this. The tire tracks, the ATM footage, the witness accounts, it was all we had to work with, and it would have to be enough, because failure wasn't an option. Not for Eve Carson, not for anyone. The deeper we dug into the events of March 4th, 2008, the more the true horror of Eve Carson's final hours began to take shape. Surveillance footage and eyewitness reports painted a vivid picture of a crime that was not just brutal, but deliberate and calculated. Eve's captors, Demario Atwater and Lawrence Lovett Jr., had no plan to let her go. From the moment they forced her into her car at gunpoint, her fate was sealed. The ATM footage was our first real breakthrough. Grainy but clear enough to recognize faces, it showed Eve sitting in the passenger seat, visibly distressed. Atwater and Lovett took turns using her bank card, withdrawing cash from multiple machines. Each transaction added another piece to the puzzle. We traced the locations: first a mall in Chapel Hill, then another ATM in Durham. The timestamps on the transactions gave us a timeline, but they also raised an unsettling question. Why had they continued driving with her? They had already taken her money. Why not leave her unharmed? The answer came as we pieced together the rest of that night. After the second ATM withdrawal, they drove Eve to a wooded neighborhood about a mile from campus. The area was quiet, isolated, the kind of place where no one would hear gunshots. Witness statements and later confessions painted a chilling picture of what happened next. Eve, a woman known for her compassion and intelligence, must have realized what was coming. She pleaded with her captors, asking them to let her go. She even suggested they pray together, a desperate attempt to appeal to their humanity. But their decision had already been made. She had seen their faces, heard their voices. For them, leaving her alive was too great a risk. They walked her deeper into the woods, the silence around them broken only by her sobs. She begged them to stop, but there was no mercy. Atwater, holding the gun, fired the first shot, hitting her in the shoulder. A second shot struck her arm. Then another, and another. By the fourth shot, Eve was still alive, her body racked with pain but her spirit unbroken. In her final act of defiance, she raised her hand in a futile attempt to shield herself. The fifth shot, fired point blank, struck her temple. It was over. The brutality of the crime was staggering. It wasn't just about taking her life, it was about the cold, calculated manner in which it was done. Atwater and Lovett showed no hesitation, no remorse. After the killing, they ran back to her car and drove off, leaving her body behind in the darkness. They kept her bank card, using it to make further withdrawals as they fled. It was greed, pure and simple, that had brought them to this point. But their greed would also be their undoing. The investigation intensified in the hours following the discovery of Eve's body. The ATM footage was released to the public and tips began pouring in. One call led us to Atwater, whose prior criminal record and appearance matched one of the men in the video. From there, the trail led directly to Lovett, a 17-year-old with a history of burglary. The pieces were falling into place, but we knew we had to proceed carefully. This wasn't just about securing an arrest, it was about building an airtight case to ensure they faced justice. As we prepared for their arrests, the weight of the community's grief was palpable. Chapel Hill was in mourning. Vigils were held on campus, candles lighting the darkness as students and faculty gathered to remember Eve. Her family, shattered by the loss, worked to preserve her memory even as they struggled to comprehend the senselessness of her death. The day we apprehended Atwater and Lovett, there was a sense of grim relief. Atwater, the man who had pulled the trigger, was charged first. Lovett followed shortly after. Both were taken into custody without incident, their defiance replaced by silence. But as they were led away, it was hard not to wonder how two young men, barely more than teenagers, could commit such an unthinkable act. Their ages only deepened the tragedy, highlighting the vast gulf between their lives and the life they had stolen. Eve Carson's murder was not just a crime, it was an affront to everything she stood for. Her life had been one of service, of striving to make the world better. That it had been taken by men who sought only to take, to destroy, made the loss all the more profound. But even in the face of such darkness, we were determined to honor her memory by bringing her killers to justice. The road ahead would be long, but we owed it to her family, and to everyone who had been touched by her light. The morning after Eve Carson's body was discovered, Chapel Hill awoke to a city in mourning. The news spread quickly, and with it came a wave of shock, anger, and profound sadness. Eve was more than just a student, she was a beacon of hope, a symbol of leadership and kindness who had touched countless lives. The senselessness of her murder struck at the heart of the community, leaving an ache that would not easily fade. Eve's family was notified shortly after her body was identified. The call to her parents was one of the most harrowing tasks we faced as investigators. When they answered, there was a brief moment of normalcy, a warmth in their voices that shattered when we told them why we were calling. Their disbelief was immediate. How could their daughter, so full of life, so close to achieving everything she had worked for, be gone? Their pain was palpable, and there was nothing we could say to make it better. Her parents, devastated, made the journey to Chapel Hill to collect their daughter's belongings. They visited the crime scene, standing in the very woods where Eve had taken her last breath. The weight of that place was unbearable. Her mother's silent tears and her father's trembling hands were reminders of the human cost behind every detail of this case. They spoke to us briefly, thanking us for our efforts, but their words were hollow, their voices distant. Their grief was a chasm we could never bridge. On campus, the impact of Eve's death was immediate and profound. Students gathered in groups, some weeping openly, others sitting in stunned silence. Vigils were organized almost immediately, the soft glow of candlelight illuminating the faces of her peers. They shared stories of her warmth, her generosity, her unwavering dedication to making the world a better place. Professors spoke of her brilliance, her drive, her potential. Eve had been the kind of person who left an indelible mark on everyone she met, and now her absence felt like a void that could never be filled. In the days that followed, the grief turned to fear. The idea that two killers were still at large cast a shadow over Chapel Hill. Parents called their children, urging them to come home or to stay inside. Students avoided walking alone, especially at night. The university ramped up security, increasing patrols and offering escorts for those who felt unsafe. The entire campus, once a place of energy and optimism, felt heavy with anxiety. The Chapel Hill Police Department felt that pressure acutely. This wasn't just about solving a crime, it was about restoring a sense of safety to a community that had been shaken to its core. Every member of the team felt the weight of Eve's story, her accomplishments, and the incredible loss her death represented. We knew we had to move quickly, not just to bring justice to Eve and her family, but to reassure the community that the people responsible would not escape accountability. In the midst of this, we pieced together the details of Eve's final hours. The ATM footage was released to the public, sparking a flood of tips. Some were false leads, but one stood out. A caller identified Demario Atwater as resembling one of the men in the video. Atwater had a criminal history, and his known associates included Lawrence Lovett Jr., who matched the description of the second suspect. With this information, we began building a case, painstakingly gathering evidence and corroborating the details. As the investigation progressed, we kept Eve's family updated. Each meeting with them was a reminder of what was at stake. They were polite, even grateful, but their grief was ever present. Her father once told me, "We just need to know why." It was a question we couldn't answer, not then and maybe not ever. The senselessness of the crime defied explanation. The community rallied around Eve's memory. Memorials were held, and a scholarship was established in her name to continue her legacy of service and leadership. Spotlight and his known associates led us to a second name, Lawrence Lovett Jr. With these connections, the case began to solidify. Atwater and Lovett fit the descriptions provided by witnesses, and their backgrounds painted a grim picture. Atwater, 21, had a history of violent behavior, while Lovett, only 17, was already entangled in criminal activity. Their lives were marked by choices that had spiraled into a night of irreversible consequences. But knowing their names wasn't enough. We needed evidence that would hold up in court. Piecing together the events of March 4th required meticulous work. We retraced their movements using surveillance footage, witness statements, and forensic evidence. The ATM withdrawals were key. Timestamps and locations provided a timeline that aligned with Eve's final hours. Additional footage captured their getaway, showing Eve's car leaving the wooded area where her body was later found. The car itself became critical. When it was recovered, forensic experts combed through it for any trace of evidence. Fibers, fingerprints, and DNA linked the vehicle to both suspects, strengthening the case against them. Every detail mattered, and every piece of evidence had to be airtight. This was a case that carried the weight of an entire community's grief, and we couldn't afford mistakes. The arrests were executed with precision. Atwater was apprehended first, and his silence during questioning was telling. He didn't protest or deny, he simply avoided incriminating himself, aware of the severity of his situation. Lovett was arrested shortly after. At just 17, his demeanor was defiant, but beneath it was the fear of a teenager who knew the gravity of his actions. As we prepared the case for court, the weight of the community's expectations bore down on us. Eve Carson's murder wasn't just a crime, it was a betrayal of everything Chapel Hill stood for. Her death had sent shockwaves through the university, the city, and beyond. Students and residents alike were desperate for answers, and the arrests provided only a partial reprieve. Justice was still out of reach, and the trial would be the next step in a long journey. In the days leading up to the trial, Eve's family remained composed but visibly heartbroken. They attended meetings with investigators, listening intently as we laid out the evidence. Their silence was heavy, their pain evident in every gesture. They didn't ask for vengeance, they asked for accountability. They wanted to know why, even though no answer could ever suffice. The suspect's court appearances drew attention from across the country. Atwater pleaded guilty, accepting a life sentence plus 30 years. In court, he turned to Eve's parents, offering an apology that felt hollow in the face of what he had done. "No matter what the court does to me," he said, "it will never be enough." His words hung in the air, a stark acknowledgement of the irreparable damage he had caused. Lovett, on the other hand, pleaded not guilty, forcing the case to trial. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and the jury deliberated swiftly. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The verdict brought relief but no joy. Eve's family left the courtroom in silence, carrying the weight of their loss as heavily as before. In the aftermath of the trial, Chapel Hill began the slow process of healing. Vigils and memorials celebrated Eve's life, focusing on her contributions and the legacy she left behind. A scholarship was established in her name, ensuring that her dedication to education and service would continue to inspire others. A memorial garden was also created at UNC, a quiet space where students could reflect on her life and the values she embodied. For the investigators, the resolution of the case brought mixed emotions. We had done our job, but the cost was immeasurable. Eve Carson's murder was a reminder of the darkness that can lurk in even the brightest places. Her life had been one of purpose and promise, and her death was a tragedy that would never fully fade. The arrests and convictions provided closure, but they could never bring back what had been taken. As we filed away the case, the image of Eve remained with us, a young woman who had given so much and had so much more to give. Her story became a driving force for many of us, a reminder of why we do this work and why we must continue, even in the face of unimaginable loss. The trial may have concluded, but the story of Eve Carson did not end there. Her legacy, forged through a life of service, leadership, and compassion, began to take root in the aftermath of her death. For her family, her friends, and the Chapel Hill community, the question was no longer just about justice, it was about how to honor the life she had lived and the dreams she had left behind. Eve's parents, still grappling with their unimaginable loss, turned their focus toward preserving her memory in meaningful ways. The creation of the Eve Marie Carson Memorial Scholarship became a cornerstone of their efforts. Funded through donations from friends, community members, and organizations inspired by her story, the scholarship provided opportunities for other promising students at UNC to pursue their own dreams of leadership and service. It was a living tribute to Eve's spirit, ensuring that her impact would continue to ripple outward. On campus, the university community came together to dedicate a memorial garden in Eve's honor. The garden, tucked away in a quiet corner of campus, became a sanctuary for reflection and remembrance. A plaque inscribed with her words learned from every single being, experience, and moment served as a reminder of her wisdom and her commitment to learning from life's challenges. Students and visitors alike found solace there, surrounded by the peaceful hum of nature, a fitting reflection of Eve's gentle but powerful influence. Beyond these physical memorials, Eve's story inspired countless individuals to carry her values forward. Annual events like the Eve Carson Memorial 5000, which raised money for local charities, became an enduring way for the community to celebrate her life. Former classmates, professors, and friends shared memories of her kindness and determination, ensuring that her example remained a guiding light for future generations. The broader impact of her death reached far beyond Chapel Hill. Conversations about safety, community, and justice took on new urgency in the wake of her murder. Universities across the country implemented enhanced security measures, and discussions about how to create safer environments for students became more prominent. While these efforts could never undo the tragedy, they stood as a testament to the enduring influence of Eve's story. For the Carson family, the pain of their loss never truly subsided, but they found ways to channel their grief into purpose. They spoke publicly about Eve's life and her values, reminding others of the importance of compassion, leadership, and service. Her father once remarked that Eve's legacy was not just in what she had accomplished, but in the countless lives she had touched and the inspiration she continued to provide. In the years following the convictions of Demario Atwater and Lawrence Lovett Jr., their actions were analyzed in countless articles and discussions, serving as a stark contrast to Eve's life. While they had chosen a path of destruction and greed, Eve had dedicated herself to building, uplifting, and giving. The juxtaposition underscored the senselessness of her death, but it also highlighted the power of her legacy. Eve Carson's memory remains a beacon of hope and resilience. Her life, though tragically cut short, became a symbol of what is possible when one chooses to lead with kindness and purpose. She had dreamed of changing the world, and in many ways she succeeded. Through the scholarships, memorials, and lives she touched, Eve's story continues to inspire countless others to follow in her footsteps. For those of us who worked on the case, Eve's impact was deeply personal. Her photo, a reminder of the vibrant life we had fought to seek justice for, stayed with us long after the files were closed. She reminded us of why we do what we do, to stand against the darkness, to protect the innocent, and to ensure that stories like hers, while devastating, are never forgotten. Today, the name Eve Carson is more than a reminder of a life taken too soon. It is a call to action, a legacy of love and service that challenges us all to strive for something greater. In her own words, learn from every being, experience, and moment, Eve continues to teach us all what it means to truly live.